Last night, GGG released the passive tree data for Path of Exile's upcoming patch, and they did so alongside a tweet that mentioned that the data also contained changes to Bloodline classes compared to what was shown off a few days back. And there's actually quite a few things to mention here, including the reveal of the Assassin small nodes from the Ascendancy rework, because we didn't have that information before, so let's begin there. The Assassin notably had one very important stat missing from the new notables on the reworked Ascendancy, that being poison chance, of course. The old Assassin had 40% poison chance on one of the previous crit poison branch notables, and on the new one, that stat was nowhere to be seen. Well, now that we can see the updated Ascendancy in full, the two small nodes in the poison branch have 15% chance to poison each, for a total of 30% chance to poison, so a bit less than the old version, but I think the upside of being able to poison with elemental damage is more than worth that trade-off. We can also see the other small nodes there on the Assassin as well, but there's nothing too much to note there. The main thing is that the Assassin does still have some poison chance on the Ascendancy itself. Now, one thing that we didn't have any information about for 3.27 was any changes to the Ascendant Assassin notable as a result of the Assassin rework, and looking over the passive tree data, it doesn't look like that's going to be a thing. Perhaps they've forgotten about the Scion version of Assassin, or perhaps they're happy with how it is, but the added crit chance is not really reflective of the Assassin anymore, as the Assassin no longer has that stat. Perhaps we'll see changes to this Ascendancy in the future, but for now, it looks like it's going to stay the same. Okay, let's move on to the Bloodline Ascendancy changes, and let's begin with the Lycia Ascendancy. The Herald branch has been changed slightly, but the most important thing to note here is that the notable itself is not nerfed. Even though some expected it to be changed before launch, it looks like that's not going to be the case. However, the small node before the notable has been nerfed. It was going to provide 20% increased Herald buff effect, and it will now just provide an increase to Herald damage and an increase to Herald minion damage. So for those builds planning to stack a few Herald skills for flat damage, this is a small nerf in the early stages where you don't have that much increased Herald buff effect, but the further you progress and once you start to stack Herald tattoos and Eldritch implicits and the nodes on the tree and cluster jewels and things like that, this change is less and less impactful. Now moving on to the Delirious Bloodline Ascendancy, and it appears that they've renamed these nodes, which is a shame. I thought the Schizophrenic Dissociation was a great name for that notable, but regardless, GGG have changed this node to actually buff it quite a bit. In the FAQ a few days back, we learned that this notable would indeed prevent the use of all non-cluster jewels in your tree, even those that were socketed in cluster jewel sockets. But now, with the passive tree data being released, we can see that they've added some extra wording here. Non-cluster, non-passage jewels socketed in your passive tree have no effect. And we get clarification in a Twitter response that passage jewels are those that allow you to allocate nodes that are not connected to your tree. So things like Intuitive Leap can actually be used with this node. So a small but impactful buff to that node, although I think the name change is strictly a nerf. Next up is the Oshabi Bloodline, and the Rage notable has received a significant change here. This node grants 20 maximum rage, which is a lot, but it also makes you lose all of your rage upon reaching maximum rage to grant a buff, and previously this was Adrenaline. Now, Adrenaline is a very strong buff. It grants 100% increased damage, 25% increased attack, cast, and movement speed, and 10% additional physical damage reduction. But it has the problematic mechanic of making you unable to gain a new Adrenaline buff while you already have one, which means that you would have this problem of reaching maximum rage before Adrenaline expired, and you just essentially lose all of your rage for nothing because it can't apply a new instance of Adrenaline as you already have one active. So for seeing this problem, they've changed this to instead grant a different buff, Wild Savagery. And in terms of power level, this buff is fairly comparable, but it's also quite different. Wild Savagery grants 100% increased physical damage, 10% increased action speed, hits ignore enemy physical damage reduction, and cannot be stunned. So for a physical damage build or a phys conversion build, I'd say these buffs are quite comparable. They each have their strengths, and they're certainly buffs you'd like to have. But for pure elemental attack builds, this buff is a lot less beneficial now compared to Adrenaline, because the damage increase is specific to physical damage. However, the most important part of this change is the fact that Wild Savagery does not carry Adrenaline's inherent trait that prevents a new buff being applied if one already exists, which means you can freely build Rage with this node, and timing is a lot less important, because even if you already have Wild Savagery, reaching maximum Rage and losing all of it will just reapply the buff again. And of course, there's also the added bonus there that if you can find another way to apply Adrenaline, you can now stack both of these buffs together, which is quite nice. Next up is the change to the Catarina bloodline. The Umbral Army notable, which grants bonuses to your character based on how many minions you have, has been nerfed. Previously, this was going to provide 12% increased defenses per Spectre, and it's now 10%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but at the top end of Spectres, this is actually quite significant, a loss of perhaps 16 to 20% increased defenses in total. Now let's move on to something which is much less of a buff or a nerf, but more so a reveal of sorts. The release of this passive tree data has allowed us to see the 10th Bloodline Ascendancy in its entirety for the first time. And even though we don't have a name for this Ascendancy, it looks like it's going to be Zesht, or some kind of amalgamation of the Breachlords minus Chayula. And this is a 3 notable Bloodline Ascendancy, with 2 particular Breachlords and their damage types highlighted in their own nodes, and then a 3rd more generic node combining them all together. Esh of the Storm. Your hits ignore enemy monster lightning resistance if all equipped rings are synaptic rings. +2 to level of all lightning skill gems if at least 4 Foulborn uniques are equipped. And +30 to intelligence. So synaptic rings are a new ring base which we don't know all that much about just yet. The speculation is that they may provide maximum lightning resistance. Now, ignoring monster resistances is quite strong. For bossing, it allows you to use other curse options such as punishment, but perhaps more notable is the use case induced mapping, where rare monster modifiers and map modifiers and altar modifiers stack up to create some extremely tanky monsters, and having a way to cut through resistances is very good. But the next line is likely the one that's going to make or break this notable. +2 gem levels for lightning skills is obviously very strong, but we lack a lot of information right now for Foulborn unique items. If a build has 4 good Foulborn unique items that it can use, then this is going to be great. But we know that there's not actually going to be that many Foulborn uniques compared to the total amount of uniques that are available in the game. And if it's the case that you're equipping some Foulborn uniques that are not very good just to satisfy this requirement, then that's not nearly as useful. So this one just comes down to what's available. Then we have the notable Tull the Blizzard. This is essentially the same but for cold damage and cold skills, and this one requires 2 cryonic rings, which again is a new ring base. So the same goes for the resistance bypass, that's a good stat, and the gem levels again, potentially very strong if the correct Foulborn unique items exist. And notably here, there's also some increased freeze duration, which is actually quite a rare stat, especially compared to the intelligence on the other notable. Freeze duration is a good stat too, because freeze works by having a minimum freeze duration that's required to actually apply the freeze in the first place. Base duration is determined by the damage versus the monster's ailment threshold. So by increasing freeze duration, you can essentially lower the amount of damage required to apply freeze, which is useful against tankier targets. Now the last notable on the new Breachlord Bloodline is Otherworldly Appendages, and this one is much more defensively oriented. Take 15% less lightning damage with at least 1 Esh graft grafted to you, and then there's the same for each damage type minus Chaos, because Chayula is notably missing from this Ascendancy. And these modifiers are referring to the new graft items available in this patch, and you'll be able to equip 2 of these, so you can actually gain 2 of these less damage taken modifiers, which is quite strong. The Ulna Toll modifier in particular, that one grants 15% less physical damage taken. That one's going to be very useful for a lot of setups, as physical damage is often quite a big problem. And this node is especially good when you can isolate 1 or 2 damage types, for example utilising mechanics such as Tempered by War to make a large chunk of lightning and cold damage be taken as fire instead, so you can essentially mitigate a lot of the incoming damage with a single modifier. Now the last line is nearby enemies take 100% increased damage from Graph skills. We don't really know how impactful Graph skills are going to be in the endgame, so this one is quite difficult to read. But considering this is on a very strong defensive node, there may be some synergy there with providing a much needed damage boost to more defensive setups. But that's all of the updated information that we got from the passive tree data file. We did also get confirmation of a delay to the 2020 gems post, which was supposed to be released last night, so hopefully that one will be out tonight, because we are only one day out from launch now. Not much time to reconsider starters, so hopefully the gem post doesn't upset too many start plans. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.